All right. Amazing chapter that we're in. Now, as we go through chapter 4, you're going to ask yourself, Craig, there's some more chairs over here if you want to put any of them out. So I know we're running out of room here. Feel free to put them wherever you want. We're going to ask ourselves before we get to end this chapter whether Nebuchadnezzar has become a believer. And I'm inclined to think that he has. Hard to be dogmatic about when half of the commentaries I read say no, he didn't. John MacArthur thinks he did, so, but we just can't be sure. But this chapter appears to have been written mostly by Nebuchadnezzar, and some Babylonian scholars who have read this chapter say that portions of it read like it was written originally in Akkadian, which is the native language of the Sumerian Empire at this point, Neo-Babylonian Empire. So it's translated from Akkadian to Aramaic to English. So we have a translation of a translation, but it has a syntax of Akkadian. So it appears to have actually been written by Nebuchadnezzar. It's the only chapter in the Bible written either by an unbeliever or a new believer. So you need to remember where we have been with Nebuchadnezzar. So in chapter 1, Nebuchadnezzar meets the Jewish exiles, Daniel and his 3 friends, and they are at the top of their class of scholars. They graduate at the top of the class, and Daniel is the outstanding member. Then remember what happens in chapter 2 of Daniel? What happens in chapter 2? We have the first dream of Nebuchadnezzar, and what happens in that dream? It's the great statue, and God communicates to Nebuchadnezzar that he is the golden head. He is the first. He's established the first kingdom ordained by God to rule over all the earth. And so he's the golden head. And it's interesting reading scholarly comments about Nebuchadnezzar. He was a military genius at a young age, defeated all of the empires of his age, united all of the empires with which he was in contact under one. But he was just a genius administrator and builder, so that Babylon becomes one of the wonders of the ancient world. But he learns, if he had been paying attention in chapter 2, that God is sovereign in establishing empires over the kingdom of man. But then in chapter 3, so chapter 2, he has a vision of a statue representing all of the empires that God has ordained to rule over mankind. And he's the golden head, but then there's a silver chest and arms, a brass abdomen and thighs, and then iron legs. And so in chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar builds a statue that's all gold. So it doesn't say explicitly that his intention was to say, my empire's not going to fall, but you kind of get that impression. And then what else happens in chapter 3 with Nebuchadnezzar's golden statue? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refuse to bow down and worship the image. So Nebuchadnezzar throws them into a fiery furnace and then observes 4 walking around in the furnace, one like a son of the gods. And when he calls them out, the 3 come out, and not only are their clothes not scorched, but they don't even have a smell of smoke on them. And Nebuchadnezzar not only bows down to them in honor of their God who delivered them, but he also issues a proclamation that nobody is to say anything bad about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's God. So God uses that to extend protection over the Jews throughout the Babylonian Empire. And when I first joined OU, the previous chairman of the chemical engineering department was an Iranian Jew. His family had been in Iran since 600 BC. He was a direct descendant of the Jews that were taken into captivity. Michael?
I wondered if there was, they went through the furnace and there wasn't the smell of smoke.
Yeah.
And I wondered, it reads a lot like when you're before the Bema seat in the New Testament and your works are being judged, and then it's burned as in hay straw.
You're saved, but as through fire.
And then some people will leave with smoke smell on it.
Well,
It just reminds me of one, but it seems like there's a strong correlation. These guys.
Well, except in this
good.
case, the fire was for the purpose of killing Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And in 1 Corinthians 3, it's for the purpose of revealing that their works were done from wrong motives.
I agree, but
Yeah.
it just seems like God rewarded their good works.
Oh, yeah.
And faith in Him.
He certainly rewarded their faith and used it to extend protection over his people throughout the Babylonian Empire.
I just saw it as kind of a rhyming.
Yeah.
Script.
All right. So when we turn to chapter 4, we think that so Nebuchadnezzar, we know from archaeology that Nebuchadnezzar ruled 43 years. Okay. We're going to see that Nebuchadnezzar suffers from a mental illness for 7 years. There is a 7-year gap in the records of Nebuchadnezzar. And there is also a 7-year period in which he engaged in no military campaigns.
So is that in the middle or the end?
It's at the end. So there appears to be about a 30-year gap between chapter 3 and chapter 4. So Nebuchadnezzar is, so if chapter 3 is somewhere around the 5th or 6th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, 30 years later, puts him at about the 35th year. He only reigns for 43. So there's only 8 years left in his reign at the beginning of chapter 4 and 7 years of him. So this is the end of the Nebuchadnezzar reigns only 1 or 2 more years after the end of chapter 4. So it's at the end of his life, God brings Nebuchadnezzar to bowing his knee before the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, the God of gods, as Nebuchadnezzar refers to him. Earlier chapters, he's referred to Daniel's God as the God of heaven, where heaven is the abode of the gods. So essentially in chapters 2 and 3, Nebuchadnezzar refers to Daniel's God as the God of the gods. And now in chapter 4, in this proclamation that appears to have been written primarily by Nebuchadnezzar himself, he calls God the Most High God. So the God above all other gods. Now it's not clear whether, matter of fact, I think you'd have to say that the evidence indicates that Nebuchadnezzar has not come to understand that there's only one God. He's not a monotheist. He still is a polytheist in thinking that there are lots of gods. But he understands that these other gods, I think that the Babylonians would have considered angels to be gods. Rather than being servants of God, they would consider them to be little g gods. He understands that there is a big gap between the little g gods and the Most High God. And we'll see that as we get near the end of the chapter. So let me just start reading through this. And this is the longest chapter in Daniel. And it's somewhat complicated here. So So it opens with Nebuchadnezzar addressing all the peoples of the earth. And now, if you think it's odd that this ancient king sitting, right on the edge of what we call the Persian Gulf, addresses all the peoples and nations and tongues of the world, you need to remember the vision he's received. He's been told that he is the Lord over all the earth. Now, that was the vision of the statue in chapter 2. And Daniel reaffirms Nebuchadnezzar's dominion over all the earth. Okay. So Nebuchadnezzar, the king of all the peoples, nations, and men of every language that live in all the earth, may your peace abound, the traditional Akkadian greeting. It has seemed good to me to declare the signs and wonders which the Most High God has done for me. So he uses a term here that any polytheist would understand, that he's referring to the God over all the gods. So he's not telling the people of his empire that there's only one God. He's saying that of all the gods, there is a God over them. So if you're the God of the gods, you are the Most High God. All right? It seemed good to me to declare the signs and wonders which the Most High God has done for me. So we're going to see that Nebuchadnezzar loses his mind for 7 years and thinks he's a cow for 7 years, but he considers it a blessing at the end of the 7 years. So, Danny, I had to think of you and Chuck. Here at the end of his 7 years of suffering, he says, I had to tell the world about the signs and wonders which the Most High God has done for me. So, Diana, yeah, God is sovereign and he's a God who loves us. And then Nebuchadnezzar breaks out in praise. How great are his signs, how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. So in chapter 2, he sees the statue with the golden head. Chapter 3, he builds a golden statue. My kingdom's going to last forever. In chapter 4, he says his kingdom is going to last forever. He's no longer claiming my kingdom is going to last forever. Only took him 7 years. 7 years of suffering to be able to come to that statement. His dominion is from generation to generation. My dominion is for my generation. And Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom fell in the time of his grandson. So there were only 3 generations of Babylonian dominion over the world. And then it passed to Cyrus the Great, and then to Alexander the Great, and then to the Roman Republic. So we get a whole proclamation, calls him the Most High God, and he acknowledges that it is God's kingdom as the everlasting kingdom versus the temporary human kingdoms. Now he reports the incident in his life that has brought him to the place for where he can acknowledge that the Most High God has the everlasting kingdom and the dominion that never ends, that goes from generation to generation. So, and it's quite a story here. This calamity comes upon him suddenly and without warning. All right. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and flourishing in my palace. I saw a dream and it made me fearful. And these fantasies, as I lay on the bed, and the visions in my mind kept alarming me. So this seems to have been a persistent. So whether he has one dream and the images from this dreams, he can't get them out of his head, or whether he's having persistent dreams, it's not clear, but this becomes something that torments him. So I gave orders to bring into my presence all the wise men of Babylon. So if you wonder why he's bringing back the guys that couldn't tell him the dream in chapter 2. Remember, it's been 30 years. It's been 30 years. And so these wise men, they weren't just, pagan sorcerers. So we associate astrology with Babylonian knowledge, but they also used the stars to, predict the seasons of the year and the length of the day. Dave and I were just looking at an article where they found a trigonometry table from used by Babylonian surveyors in the dividing up land.
They were the scientists.
They were, yeah.
When to plant, when to harvest.
When to expect the floods to occur. And, they built canals, they built dams, they built irrigation channels. They had running water in their homes in Babylon. These weren't guys, sleeping with the camels in a tent in the Arabian desert. This was a very sophisticated society. So these are all the wise men.
So they had pipes and everything else? that ran-
Yeah. Well, yeah, at least the rich people did. So yeah, Nebuchadnezzar had running water in his palace. I think if you've heard of the hanging gardens of Babylon, one of the seven wonders, he actually built a huge palace, but on the outside of it, it's terraced with gardens, water from the Euphrates River up to the top that then ran in streams to water the gardens. One of the seven wonders of the ancient world. Then the magicians, the conjurers, the Chaldeans, diviners came in, and I related the dream to them, but they could not make its interpretation known to me. Now, we see dreams all the way through Daniel, and this is part of the Babylonian culture. People believe that the gods communicated through dreams. And we've talked about this before, but the Babylonian wise men, we call them academics or scholars, they recorded thousands of dreams, and then they recorded what happened to the person who had the dream. So they actually tried to correlate dream images within observations of historical events that followed those dreams. So, they couldn't do a Google search of their records. So being able to find the images in past dreams and then what happened as a result, basically meant you had to memorize all these dreams. Go ahead, Greg.
I'm gonna say they still do.
Oh, yeah.
In fact, a friend of mine, this was exciting, that he was studying the Bible with a son, and the mother told him, my friend Jeff, she said, I had a dream, and Jesus was blessing you from heaven, and you were chanting something, and I couldn't understand it. And he told her, well, it was probably the scriptures. And she began to study the Bible because she had that dream. So the people we're working with, some of them, they're having these dreams. They have a whole way of interpreting them.
Yeah. Who wrote the book Epicenter? What's the name? Rosenberg. If you get in the last chapter of Epicenter, Rosenberg tells the story. He talked with two U.S. diplomats who were in Iraq and had been recruited to smuggle Bibles into Iran. And yeah, how many of y'all read the book God's Smuggler? You remember that book, God's Smuggler? They get met by God's Smuggler, the same guy. He's now working in Iraq to smuggle Bibles into Iran. And so they go to pick up the Bibles, and he just dumps the Bibles in their trunk. And they say, how are we going to get these through? How are we going to get these through customs? They're never going to let us in with these Bibles. And he said, don't worry about it. They won't see them. Just drive right on through. So they go to drive into Iran. The guards stop them. They tell them to open the trunk. They look at the Bibles, and then they just close the trunk, let them through. So they're driving along a mountain road and suddenly the car just stops. The lights go out, the radio goes off, everything, it just stops. And simultaneously there's on the window of their car, they almost jump out of their skin, but they open the door and there's an old man, long white beard, white hair. And he says to him, "Are you the guys?" And they say, "What guys?" And he says, "The guys with the Bibles." And they say, "Well, we got Bibles, but we weren't bringing them. This is not where we're bringing them to." He says, "Well, everybody in my village last night had the same dream. And we were told that you would be here with the Bibles at this point. So they sent me to meet you to bring you to the village." So they followed the guy to the village and they distributed the Bibles. So that's in Rosenberg's epicenter. So it is part of the culture. So Jeff Bachman has a similar story that he could tell you if you get a chance to talk to him when he's here one time. So it's one of our missionaries we support. But for some reason, the scholars can't interpret this dream. And this is peculiar, partly because the images in Nebuchadnezzar's dream are standard dream images for the culture at the time. So we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go through here, but I think the problem is not that they didn't know what the images stood for, because Daniel's interpretation of the images is pretty consistent with what would have been the standard interpretation. I think they were just scared to tell him. I think they might have been scared to tell him, partly because he had a habit of people that he disapproved of tearing them limb from limb and turning their houses into a rubbish piles. But also you can see how, if you tell the king that he's going to lose his mind for 7 years and then it doesn't happen, it's going to be a bad spot on your record. So,
Jeff, I was just curious, have you read what, like the Talmud of how the Jews view Nebuchadnezzar?
No, I haven't. I haven't read
I'll
that.
have to look that up.
Okay, yeah, I haven't read that. It's interesting. Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that.
Yes, it intrigues me at the opening verse there. It reminds me of David in the spring at the times when you go out to battle. I was at ease in my home.
Yeah, he had conquered everybody. Everybody was defeated. It is like David, isn't it? Yeah. So this is called the Gilgamesh Dream Tablet. I don't know if you saw this. It was recently seized by customs from Hobby Lobby. So apparently this was smuggled out of Iraq, and the owners of Hobby Lobby bought it, not realizing it was an illegal artifact that had been stolen from the museum in Baghdad. And so they turned it back over to now the headlines all said, stolen artifacts seized by customs from Hobby Lobby owners. They turned it over to them, but they still seized it in the headlines. Anyway, this is a portion of something called the Epic of Gilgamesh. Have you heard of the Epic of Gilgamesh? So Gilgamesh is the Adam and Noah of Babylon, of the Babylonian creation myths. And he survives a worldwide flood, just like Noah. And this is a portion of a copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh that contains a dream that Gilgamesh had, in which there's a tree, there are watchers, there are birds, there are beasts, very, very similar to Nebuchadnezzar's dream here. So they should have been able to interpret it, but they chose not to. I mean, there's just no explanation for why they couldn't. And Terry talked to us about when Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's dream back in Genesis. He just said sometimes when a patient has a dream, it doesn't matter what interpretation you give, they're happy with it. But there's certain dreams that they're not satisfied until you give them the interpretation that clicks.
Yeah.
So we don't know whether whether the interpretations they gave, he just didn't swallow them. He wasn't satisfied with them. It's unclear.
It wasn't right.
It just wasn't right, and he knew it wasn't right.
There's a lot of emotion tied to it, so no, you're not gonna accept something that's not right.
So what I remember you told us about Joseph's interpretation was a lot of times this is a key period in a patient's recovery. And that if you get that dream right, that changes their lives.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we see with Joseph and Pharaoh. And now we see the same thing with Nebuchadnezzar. Finally, Daniel came in before me, whose name is Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God, Bel. Daniel, in whom is a spirit of the holy gods. All right. Now, all of the commentators make clear that this phrase is ambiguous. And you could equally well translate it as the spirit of the holy God. So that would be a legitimate interpretation. And different Bibles translate it different ways, but both are possible. And the ones that translate it a spirit of the holy gods are wanting to communicate that Nebuchadnezzar is still a polytheist. Those that translate it the spirit of the holy God are wanting to communicate that he may have become a believer in Daniel's God here. And MacArthur points out that the Babylonians did not call their gods holy because their gods were depraved. They were as bad as politicians. Okay. So you didn't expect them to behave in a holy way. So the fact that he calls him a spirit of the holy God, MacArthur thinks he's recognizing that Daniel's God is not like the other gods. He's separate. And I related the dream to him saying, "Oh, Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, since I know that the spirit of the holy God is in you and no mystery baffles you, tell me the visions of my dream, which I have seen, along with its interpretation." This sounds like an echo of chapter 2 when he demands that the magicians also tell him the dream as well as the interpretation. Now, these are the visions in my mind as I lay in my bed. I was looking, and behold, there was a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. And this would have been recognized by all of the magicians as a symbol of a kingdom or a king. And there's an identification of the kingdom with the king in ancient political science. I mean, there's not a separation between the king and the kingdom. And its height was great. And the tree grew, and then the Aramaic, this chapter is actually written in Royal Aramaic or Imperial Aramaic, even though Akkadian is the language of the Babylonians. But Aramaic was a universal language of the day. Everybody spoke Aramaic. They might not all speak Hebrew, they might not all speak Egyptian, they might all not speak Persian, but they all speak Aramaic, similar to the way it is today. The tree, and so we switch into poetry here. The tree grew large and became strong, and its height reached the sky, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth. It's a big, big tree. So over the horizon big. Its foliage was beautiful, its fruit abundant, it was food for all. And I see that and I think of the prayer that we're commanded to pray in 1 Timothy 2 for kings and all those in authority, that we might live a quiet life, godly life in all dignity, a quiet and godly life in all dignity. That's our prayer for our government, the rulers in our government. And it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it. The birds of the sky dwelt in its branches, and all living creatures fed themselves from it. So it was an umbrella providing shade and sustenance to all the creatures of the world. And so those are symbols of peoples and nations, tribes. And it covers the whole earth, and it has a purpose, and it provides care and support for the inhabitants of the earth. So this is a artist's conception. You can see the Mediterranean over on one side and the Persian Gulf over here, the Arabian Gulf down here. So we don't know exactly what he saw. This is another version where you see the birds of the air and the beasts underneath it. And I was looking into visions in my mind as I lay on my bed, and behold, an angelic watcher, a holy one, descended from heaven. Okay. The Babylonians believed in messengers from the gods who were sent by the gods to observe what was going on among mankind to then report back to the gods. So it appears as though, so whether Nebuchadnezzar saw an angel, like we see in the book of Revelation, and then he interpreted it as being one of these watchers, or the Babylonian gods, is what it seems like is going on here. And he descended from heaven and he shouted out and spoke as follows: chop down the tree, cut off its branches, strip its foliage, scatter its fruit, let the beast flee from it and the birds from its branches. So he issues a command to chop down the tree and strip it of its branches and its fruit. Okay. So this is a Babylonian relief, and you can see the watcher over here on the left of center, observing, what's going on. Matter of fact, here he's observing a sacrifice. And then here's the winged watcher over here on the left, underneath the tree. So exactly what it was, we don't know what Nebuchadnezzar saw, but he interpreted it as one of these beings sent from the gods to observe and deliver their messages to mankind. And then the watcher continues, he says, leave the stump with its roots in the ground, but with a band of iron and bronze around it, in the new grass of the field, and let him. So now, instead of referring to the tree as a plant here, now it seems to be talking specifically about the king. So the king and the kingdom here are equated. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. Let him share with the beasts in the grass of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a mind, and let a beast mind be given to him, and let 7 periods of time pass over him. So leave the stump so the tree can grow back. It can spring back from the stump. Don't dig up the stump. Matter of fact, put protection around the stump to prevent it from being removed. Leave the roots, Michael.
I wanted to know if a person can survive on grass for 7 years of grass and water, or does grass mean more like you could be eating vegetables from the field and stuff like that?
I tried to trace that down and I couldn't figure it out. This section is not in Hebrew, it's in Aramaic, and we just don't have a lot of literature. So I don't know if this word could be broader than just the grass that a cow eats. I couldn't figure it out. And I didn't see anybody in the commentaries commenting on that. So. Yeah, Keith.
In the context of the term periods of time,
Yeah.
that's a debatable term
Yes.
that's used all through, especially in
Yep.
Genesis, so forth. Does that tie back to the same sort of meaning and language as people try to talk about periods of time in the first chapter of Genesis? In other words,
This is Aramaic,
yeah,
and Genesis is Hebrew. So this is not the word yom.
okay.
It's not the same
I
word.
didn't figure.
But it is. It's even more ambiguous than yom. So it just said basically, let sevens pass over him. Let 7 pass over him. So is it hours, days, months, years? It's undeterminable from the word itself. You have to determine it from the context. Now, we think we conclude that it's years because of the description of his hair growing long and matted and his nails growing out to where they look like claws. And then we have the archaeological discovery of the 7-year gap in his royal records, and also a 7-year period in which there were no military operations. So it does appear to be years, but you can't tell from the word that's used in the Aramaic here. Every time I think about this being written in Aramaic, Isaac Newton wrote a commentary on Daniel. Now, he already knew Latin and Greek, but he taught himself Hebrew and Aramaic and did his own translation of the original manuscript. So he did his own translation of the Aramaic, and then he wrote his commentary in Latin. This is, where do these guys come from? I've never met anybody like this. Now he receives the mind of a beast, so he thinks he's a cow. Well, it's not specific here, but he thinks he's a cow. It's a beast. So, so for 7 years he identifies as a cow. I guess is the way we put it in our today.
You'd be seeing Terry.
You'd be seeing Terry.
Seeing Terry.
And so the angelic watcher continues. This sentence is by decree of the watchers, and the decision is a command of the holy ones, so the gods. In order, listen to this. So what's the purpose of this decree on Nebuchadnezzar? What's the purpose of this decree on Nebuchadnezzar? That the living may know that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind. So the purpose of this chapter is that mankind, so that we would know that God is the ruler of mankind. So I don't care what they say on NBC or MSNBC or Fox News, whatever they say, Daniel chapter 4, God is the ruler. Okay. You can't forget that. Neil, go ahead.
Given the intrigue that involved all these dynasties, all
Yes.
these rulerships, your leader going crazy for 7 years would cause a changeover.
Yeah.
So, God's hand had to be in it, because if man was in control of this,
He would have been
would have been
replaced
succeeded
just
by
like
another person.
Yeah,
immediately,
probably his own son.
and probably
Yeah,
murdered in the process.
probably murdered in the process. So, yeah, Michael.
I would think there's every reason to believe that Daniel,
Yeah,
being second in charge, and Daniel giving the prophecy and Daniel following God, said, I'm not gonna let that
Yeah.
happen.
Yeah, that's probably true.
yeah. We don't get an interpretation of the bands of iron and brass that protect the stump, but my guess is that's Daniel and his direct reports.
Mhm.
And what we're going to see is there's actually a year between the giving of the prophecy and its initiation of the fulfillment. So Daniel had a year to prepare for what comes. So I think it's most likely that Daniel protects Nebuchadnezzar through this 7-year period and has people watching over him, or he never would have survived in the culture. The decision is a command of the holy ones in order that the living may know that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind and bestows it on whom he wishes and sets over it the lowliest of men. I was waiting for that. So here is Nebuchadnezzar telling the world that God sets the lowliest of men over the kingdoms that he establishes. That's a humble statement by a mighty king in his 60th year. Okay. This is the dream which I, King Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. Now you, Belteshazzar, tell me the interpretation, inasmuch as none of the wise men had the guts to tell me what they thought it meant. Possible paraphrase there. But you are able, for a spirit of the holy gods is in you. Then Daniel, whose name is Belteshazzar, was appalled. So I just imagine Daniel standing in front of Nebuchadnezzar and he just turns white and he has a look of shock on his face. And it is so evident that Nebuchadnezzar can tell that he's stunned by the dream. And Daniel was appalled as his thoughts alarmed him. And the king responded and said, Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its interpretation alarm you. Now notice we've shifted to third person at this point. So this is probably written by Daniel. This is probably Daniel. So this might have been written by Daniel. So I think what we have here is we have the proclamation of Nebuchadnezzar, and in the middle of it, Daniel has clarified what happened. So we shift from first person written by Nebuchadnezzar to third person written by Daniel. And Nebuchadnezzar says, I can take it. Tell me the truth. For whatever reason, the other interpreters, dream interpreters, were unwilling to to give their interpretation here. Possibly because they didn't want to be torn from limb, possibly because they gave it and it was rejected. They might have spun it because they were afraid to tell him what the dream meant. Belteshazzar replied, my lord, if only the dream applied to those who hate you and its interpretation to your adversaries. The tree that you saw, which became large and grew strong, whose height reached to the sky and was visible to all the earth, whose foliage was beautiful, its fruit abundant, and which was food for all, under which the beasts of the field dwelt. It is you, O king. For you have become great and grown strong, and your majesty has become great and reached to the sky, and your dominion to the end of the earth. So here, Daniel reaffirms yet again that Nebuchadnezzar has been delegated by God authority over all the earth. Now, if we go to chapter 2, that delegation of authority goes from Babylon to Persia to Greece to Rome, and it continues right down to the last days, the time of the return of the time of the coming of the king. So right now, that dominion over all the earth is delegated to the nation of the United States of America. So 1/2 of all the world's military expenditures are from the United States. The United States military expenditures exceed the combined military expenditures of the next 7 nations combined. Russia, China, France, Germany, United Kingdom, Japan, Taiwan. China's military expenditures are 5% of the United States military expenditures. So I worked with a guy who was the general in charge of the Mideast Air Wing during his career. And he told me 30 years ago that if there was an invasion of the Middle East by Russia, that it would go nuclear in 3 days. No matter how they war gamed it, the United States could not stop a Russian invasion. I asked him the other day if he had an update on that. And he said the war would be over with in 3 days because we would shoot down their entire Air Force in 3 days. So these new F-35, F-22 fighters, there's nothing like them anywhere in the world. And I read an interview with an F-35 fighter in a battle, war gamed against F-15s. An F-15 has never been shot down. No F-15 has ever been shot down. In the history of the world, there's never been a fighter that was never lost in combat. And the F-35 fighter said, going against the F-15s, he said it was like killing baby seals. So they were absolutely defenseless against the new weapon systems. They never even knew where I was as I shot them out of the sky. They never even had a chance to take a defensive move. So he said the situation has changed so completely from 25 years ago that there would be no contest between the United States and Russia. It'd be over with quickly.
You know, this is the grace of God, but a
Yeah.
friend of mine, he's actually at the University of Hong Kong, University of Hong Kong. But he did a whole study, but he said everywhere where Protestantism has gone in the world, the standard of living
Gone up.
has increased.
It is you, O King. Your dominion is to the end of the earth, just as the United States is. And that the King, I've got 12 verses to cover in 4 minutes. Somebody's coming in after us here, so. In that the King saw an angelic watcher descending from heaven, saying, chop down the tree, yet leave the stump. Let him be drenched with dew. This is the interpretation, O King, the decree of the Most High. You will be driven away from mankind. Your dwelling place will be with the beasts of the field. You will be given grass to eat like cattle. And I don't know if it's grass or if it's a broader term. Be drenched with the dew of the heaven for sevens. Years, months, days, I think years, because of the gap in the royal record of Nebuchadnezzar, until you recognize the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind and bestows it on whomever he wishes. You, Nebuchadnezzar was a brilliant, I mean, he's one of the most brilliant people in human history. Military genius, conquered the world at a young age, built one of the 7 wonders of the world in the city of Babylon. But that was because God chose him for that. Not because of anything that he could have done on his own. Nebuchadnezzar must humble himself before God before he is restored. But there's a promise of restoration. In that it was commanded to leave the stump and the roots. Your kingdom will be assured to you after you recognize that heaven rules. So there's a way out of the locked room here. There's a way out of the prison cell. Bow the knee to God. There's a way out. Bow the knee to God. Submit to God. And then, now this is interesting. Daniel communicates that this might not happen to him if he repents now. Therefore, O King, may my advice be pleasing you. Break away from your sins by doing righteousness and from your iniquities by showing mercy, in case there may be a prolonging of your prosperity. And when I read that, I can't help but think of the slave labor that probably went into building this magnificent city, Babylon. And how many people died building Nebuchadnezzar's great city. And he says, show mercy to the poor. So all this happened to Nebuchadnezzar the king. 12 months later, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. The king reflected and said, is this not Babylon the Great, which I myself have built as a royal residence by the might of my power and the glory of my majesty, or the glory of my majesty? No sooner were the words out of the king's mouth than a voice came from heaven saying, King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is declared, sovereignty has been removed from you. You will be driven from mankind. Your dwelling place will be with the beasts. You will be given grass to eat, and 7 will pass over you until you recognize the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind and bestows it on whomever he wishes.
That 12 months, everybody should have been wondering, is this going to happen or is it not going to happen?
That's, I
If
think.
it doesn't happen, what's going to happen?
He would have had, he should have been repenting and then it would have been delayed. So I got a message here. Months here. Yeah. Yeah. So the word months is actually not in the original. And so if months is in your translation, then that's an interpretation of the translators. And they may be responding to Michael's question about could he live for 7 years on grass? No, yeah, not for 7 years.
I thought the human body couldn't process cellulose.
No, it can't. It can't. So whether that's a separate miracle. So here's an artist's conception of King Nebuchadnezzar the Great looking over at the Hanging Gardens. And I've got 30 seconds, 60 seconds here. So I don't know how I'm going to cover all this. This is quoted by Walvoord in his commentary. The setting of the scene, this is written by a Babylonian scholar. The setting of the scene and the king's self-complacence in his glorious Babylon are strikingly true to history. Every student of Babylonia recalls these proud words in Nebuchadnezzar's own records. So these are recovered documents from archaeological excavations in Babylon. Then built I the palace of the seat of my royalty, the bond of the race of men, and the dwelling of joy and rejoicing. And that's in one document. The second document, in Babylon, my dear city, which I love, was the palace, the house of wonder to the people, the bond of the land, the brilliant place, the abode of the majesty of Babylon. And the Babylonian scholar goes on to say the very language of the story is reminiscent of Akkadian, the native language of the Babylon, the syntax of Daniel's story. The glory of Babylon, that great city, remained long to conjure the imagination of raconteurs. So Herodotus writes about the legend of Babylon 2 centuries later. Immediately, the word concerning Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven from mankind, et cetera, et cetera. Anybody recognize this? Have you seen this drawing before? Anybody know what it is? Anybody know who the artist? Yeah. William Blake. William Blake. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night. He was also an artist, and this is his drawing of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, Terry, I'm sorry I don't have time for you to exposit on this, but Constable quotes multiple psychologists referring to the mental illnesses of zoanthropy and boanthropy. They're particularly interesting that the patient thinks that they are an animal, but they retain their ability to reason, but they have a persistent mental illusion that they're an animal. And there are multiple documentations of this illness. So this description of Nebuchadnezzar is not a fantasy, it's a known mental illness, which is readily treated today. Okay. So today there are multiple successful treatment protocols for someone suffering from this type of illness. But until the last century or two, we couldn't deal with this successfully. At the end of the period, I got 5 verses to go. At the end of the period, I raised my eyes toward heaven, my reason returned. I blessed the Most High God, praised and honored him who lives forever, not the one who lives for 70 years at the best, maybe a little bit longer, and honored him. And for his dominion is an everlasting dominion, not my dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation, not my kingdom. All the inhabitants of the earth are counted as nothing, but he does according to his will in the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. No one can ward off his hand or say to him, what have you done? And I still remember a bathroom inscription from when I was an undergraduate at Texas A&M. Someone had written on a wall, God is dead, and then put Nietzsche underneath it. And underneath that, someone else had replied, Nietzsche is dead, God. Psalm 115, our God is in the heavens. He does whatever he pleases. No one can ward off his hand. My reason returned, my majesty and splendor were restored. My counselors and nobles began seeking me out. Thank you, Daniel. And now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and honor the King of heaven, for all of his works are true, his ways just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride. Let me close for us. Father, thank you for this amazing, amazing chapter. And God, Father, bless us, your children. And may this chapter be a lens through which we can view the world in which we live with greater wisdom. And we pray this for your glory. Amen.